good afternoon, good morning to everybody, and welcome to this webinar from the Investment Climate Reform Facility. My name is Owen Dowsett. I'm a senior consultant for the Global Social Enterprise Programme at the British Council, and we are delivering this webinar in partnership with various partners who you'll hear from in the course of the next 90 minutes or so. So firstly, I'd just like to say thank you everybody so much for joining. We have people that have joined from as far afield as Jamaica, as Cape Verde, as Gabon, Malawi, and various countries in other regions of the world as well. So thank you so much for taking the time for this. And we're really hoping to have some good presentations, some great discussions and some great responses, hopefully from you all as well. And I will just talk through quickly some of the ways that that can be done. Just to note that this session is being recorded and it will be uploaded within the software towards the end of the session if you wanted to download it. And I'm sure the technical experts here will also be sending it round in an email or a link to it after the session as well, in case you miss any of it. Now I know this is a bit of a new forum. It's a new forum for me now that Zoom has various security issues and we're not on Microsoft Teams. You hopefully have a panel on your screen somewhere, which should hopefully include a questions option. So that is where you would go if you want to ask a question at any point. We are hoping to mainly focus the questions in two particular bits of the session. So we're going to be hearing from a couple of speakers first in the first part of the session, and then we will be having a kind of 10-minute break, during which any kind of questions that have come up already, we can try and field some of those. And then at the end of the session as well, there will be opportunity for questions and answers, and you are able to direct them to a particular speaker if your question is relevant to a particular speaker. So this, as you know, hopefully is a webinar which is going to be looking at policy and social enterprise and impact business and the social economy within the COVID context, both in terms of the immediate crisis and the longer term recovery. And so the agenda today is very much focused on that. We are going to be hearing from my colleague Irene in a second, who is just going to give a little bit of background about the Investment Climate Reform Facility, which this is a part of. And then I will just be returning to the aims and objectives of the session and just to give a couple of introductions. And then we're going to hear from our first speakers, firstly about government policies regarding social enterprise and the kind of COVID context at the moment. We will then be having an example of what's been happening in France with a fantastic speaker from the French government. We will then have that first break and opportunity to ask any questions. And then we will get going on to our next set of speakers, firstly to hear about wider sector responses to COVID within the social enterprise ecosystem or the impact business ecosystem, and intermediaries and support organisations within that field and how they're responding to COVID. And we will then be hearing from somebody in Ghana who is going to draw on some examples from there about the social enterprise response in a Ghanaian context. And finally, it will come back to me, and I'm just going to try and tie things together a little bit. Hopefully I do it okay, and pull together some conclusions and also point you in the direction of how you can get more information or support for what you want to do. So hopefully that's okay, and hopefully you're all hearing me. We've currently got 64 attendees, which is great, and I'm really happy that you've all found the time to join us, and please do stay. And without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Irene Dankwa, who is just going to give a little bit of information about the Investment Climate Reform Facility. So Irene, please.
Thank you, Owen. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you may be joining us from the Africa, Caribbean, and Pacific regions and any other regions. Thank you for joining us once again. So this is the 5th edition of the ICR response to COVID-19 webinar series. And I'm going to give you a brief background on the investment climate reform, which you will usually hear as a ICR facility. So this facility is being co-financed by the European Union, the Organization of African, Caribbean and Pacific States under the 11th European Development Fund, together with the German Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development, BMZ, and the British Council. This project is also being implemented by GIZ, British Council, Expertise France, Netherlands Development Organization, SNV. What does this project seek to do? So the project is seeking to support public and private sector stakeholders in the Africa, Caribbean, Pacific regions with their business environment reforms and investment climate reforms to attract or to increase SDG-related investments. By doing this, we hope that businesses will be able to create more jobs, and not just jobs, decent jobs, and it will also improve the livelihoods in the ACP countries. We are doing this in 3 ways. 1, we are providing technical assistance for business, environment, and investment climate reform. 2, we are strengthening national and sub-regional development financial institution. And the 3rd one, which this webinar comes under, is we are compiling and mainstreaming and sharing best practices, lessons learned within the Africa, Caribbean, Pacific. So this webinar is supposed to share what is happening and also for us to learn from you, those who have joined, what is happening, so that at the end of the day, we can apply and we can improve the business environment in these ACP countries. I will share a little bit more information on the first ways in which we are working, because there are opportunities for us to also continue to support you. In the first way we are assisting, which I mentioned, we are providing technical assistance for business environment reforms. So if in your country you are undertaking any business environment reforms, such as business registration, licensing, investment policy, tax administration, and you want us to assist you to implement or to design or to evaluate these reforms, you can send us an email, and then we will then show you how you can apply to receive technical assistance. But bear in mind that you should be either an EU delegation, you should be a business association in the ACP country, you should be a government agency in the ACP country, and among others. There is a fact sheet that we are going to upload in the user panel that you can get more information on. So if you are undertaking any business environment reforms, or you are seeking to promote inclusive business models, or you're also seeking to strengthen public-private dialogue processes, we are here to support you, and we will be here. We would like to hear from you. Please find out more information from the fact sheet, which my colleague will be sharing with you. On this webinar, so as I mentioned, this is a webinar series, and this is the first of them. There are other webinars that are taking place, and we will also upload a fact sheet on that so that you will know which webinars are taking place, so that apart from this one, you can join the others. We thank you once again, and we look forward to hearing your questions and discussing and seeing how best we can improve the business environment to attract more investment, especially during this COVID-19 period. Thank you once again. Back to you, Owen.
Thank you very much, Irene. That is great. Let me just turn on my camera again. Various buttons to press here. Okay, so thank you, Irene. This is, as she said, a great opportunity to seek further assistance. So as we go through the presentations, please do have an active mind about what kind of support might be relevant to your own countries, to your own organizations, to your own ecosystems. So just to remind ourselves of the aims and objectives of this webinar, firstly, give actionable examples and insights for policymakers and others that influence the business environment across Africa, the Caribbean and the Pacific to support social enterprises and impact businesses in mitigating the COVID-19 crisis. Now, I realise as I say that is quite a lengthy sentence, so hopefully it makes some sense. The second point, to stimulate interest amongst participants to get more tailored guidance in the form of a virtual clinic. So in addition to what Irene's just said, there is opportunity to seek some one-to-one virtual clinics in the next couple of weeks after this session. So please also do keep in mind if that will be of interest to you, and we'll be following up with some slides which show how you can do that later in the session. So without further ado, I want to just introduce our first 2 speakers. So firstly, we're going to be hearing from Dan Gregory, who works for Social Enterprise UK and is a strong partner of the British Council and indeed the Investment Climate Reform Facility. Dan has supported social enterprises for over 10 years, developing policy at the highest level and delivering in practice at the grassroots. He has worked for the Treasury and Cabinet Office, where he led the development of government policy on social enterprise, access to finance, and the role of the voluntary and community sector in public service delivery. For Social Enterprise UK, Dan has advised government departments globally on the development of social enterprise policies and has led research into social enterprise in around 20 countries. Now, after Dan's shown a few slides, he's going to also be introducing another speaker, and so I'm just going to give a brief introduction to her as well at this point. That is Sarah Prince-Robin, and I hope I've pronounced your name okay, Sarah. Sarah is the diplomatic advisor of Christophe Itier, the French High Commissioner for Social and Solidarity Economy and Social Innovation. She is in charge of monitoring and implementing France's European and international strategy in promoting the social and solidarity economy and social innovation. She is also the representative of the French government to the European Expert Group. Prior to joining the cabinet, she worked for international organizations, think tanks, and non-governmental organizations in various sectors. So it's really good to have her on board, and we look forward to hearing from her. But first of all, I would like to pass over to Dan Gregory from Social Enterprise UK. Welcome, Dan.
Hi, folks. Thank you, Owen. Can you all see me and hear me okay, Owen?
Can't see you currently, but we can hear you.
Okay.
Yeah.
Hi.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah,
excellent. So thank you very much, Owen, and thank you, colleagues at the British Council, Irene, and GIZ, and all our partners. It's fantastic to be part of this, so thank you. It's really great to be here. Just by a quick way of introduction, I work at Social Enterprise UK. Social Enterprise UK is a national membership organisation based in London, in England. We have about 3,000 members who are all social enterprises. Some are very small organisations, some are multi-million-pound organisations that work across the world. They work in every sector of the economy. They sell coffee, chocolate, they deliver public services, they run cultural venues, community buildings, and they work really in almost any part of the economy you can imagine. And our job really is to support our members and do our best to help the social enterprise movement to flourish at home, but increasingly around the world. Over the last 5-10 years, we've been very, very fortunate to share our experiences of social enterprise policy and practice in about 20-30 plus countries around the world, often working with Owen and our friends at the British Council, and working in South America, in Africa, in Southeast Asia, in fact, in just about every region of the world. Much of this work has been research, some policy work, and I think it's really allowed us to learn and above all share experiences and share knowledge, lessons from the UK to elsewhere and vice versa, and we've learned so much from that, and it's been really helpful and valuable to social enterprises on the ground to share the experiences that we've learned. We always hope we're useful. We hope we can be useful today, and my aim really is just to introduce some of an overview of what's been going on recently in government policy with regards to social enterprise and the social economy, and to hope to start that process of learning from different countries. So thank you. So hopefully you can see the slides. The first one, I know I don't need to remind people about the COVID crisis. I know we're all, I think, very aware and probably particularly focused on issues for our friends and family and immediate communities, but clearly this is a global pandemic, and we've seen this spread in all corners of the world. Obviously at different stages, different speeds, different levels of severity, but it's very clear that it's affecting just about every country in the world. I also wanted to look a little bit at the economic impact of the crisis, and you can see the other graph on your screen shows I think GDP in a number of different regions, and you can see that whichever region we're looking at, there's been it's massive economic impact in many different parts of the world. In response to this, governments have stepped up and acted in in different ways, but in many similar ways too, injecting an extra $9 trillion of fiscal support into the global economy, and taking steps to try and mitigate some of the economic impact of the crisis. I also just wanted to show this to give a sense of how this has affected countries in different ways and regions in different ways. You can see the speed at which the crisis arrived is slightly different, starting perhaps in certain countries and maybe being managed more effectively in some than others, and it's really just kicking off or just getting going or starting to reach a peak and decline in some other countries. So you can see that I think this is really just to reinforce the message that we have much to learn from each other. Those of us who are behind others or ahead of others in terms of where we are in the crisis, we can learn from responses that governments have made, and I really just want to reinforce that message of sharing knowledge, sharing understanding, and trying to see where we can avoid mistakes that have been made in some places and take inspiration from some of the better practice around the world. One final note of introduction that I just wanted to make, that I think Owen touched on this briefly, that the aim of this webinar is to look at the responses to the crisis with regard to social enterprise, impact business and the social economy. Now, we're not in this particular session being precious about particular definitions or conceptions of these things. We're interested in learning from different approaches to this, and we're not set on defining a certain group of organisations and saying we're only interested in these. So my organisation is very focused on social enterprise, and we have an approach to understanding what we mean by that. Others in other parts of the world and in the UK and elsewhere are interested in what they might call impact businesses or inclusive business or profit with purpose businesses. I think Sarah's title talks about social and solidarity economy, and we know that in France and Spain and Greece and South America and other parts of the world, there's a very strong and important tradition of understanding the social and solidarity economy. We all have our own cultures, ideologies, approaches, particular interests. It doesn't really matter too much for today's purposes, because regardless of how those organisations are defined or grouped together, we can all learn from government policies and practices which are aimed at a certain group, however they are defined. So, for example, we might talk more about social enterprise, others social and solidarity economy. Mohammed Yunus from Bangladesh always talks about social business, and he has his own conception of that. There are other alternative approaches and ways of thinking about these organisations, which to me are all part of a family, and they all have differences, and it's an overlapping family and group, and you can draw circles around them in different ways. But for us, really, the main thing here is to learn from what actions have been taken, what have governments done, what have these organisations and their representatives been doing, however they define themselves. So we're not precious about particular definitions. Okay, so just to introduce the structure of what we wanted to discuss today. I think there's about sort of 4 sections which we wanted to cover. Myself and Sarah will be covering the first 2, which is predominantly focused on the government's response to the crisis, and Maeve from the Social Enterprise World Forum will be talking a bit more about wider responses that are not necessarily governmental after the break. In terms of the government responses, I think it's quite important to draw a distinction between 2 types of approaches that any government can take. And this is something that we learned and focused a lot on over the last 5 years, regardless of COVID and the recent crisis. We know that these organisations, these businesses that particularly are set up with a social purpose, constitute one particular subset of the wider business community or the wider economy as a whole, including public, private, social sector organisations. Sometimes governments have taken responses and introduced policies and strategies that are targeted specifically at a subset of organisations, saying this is, for example, a social enterprise action plan or a social economy strategy, or here is our ministry or department for cooperatives, for instance, and they're targeted at that specific subset of organisations. Nevertheless, governments around the world also have wider policies towards all business, perhaps towards small and medium-sized enterprises, SMEs or MSMEs, perhaps towards all businesses in an economy. And therefore, we must never forget that social enterprises, impact businesses, however you define them, are part of that wider group. And therefore, they're part of that wider enabling environment that government can sort of shape and nudge and develop over time through its actions. So I think it's quite important to stress here that the way in which governments have responded to the crisis, we can see them in two ways. First of all, have they responded specifically to introduce measures to support the social economy and social enterprises, and what have they done more widely, perhaps to all businesses, but which of course have some impact on social enterprises and some relationship to social enterprises and similar businesses. So the first four examples I want to give are around very specific examples. Now, it's probably worth emphasising that if you look around the world across dozens of countries, there aren't in every country social enterprise or social economy specific responses. This is only in some countries. So in Europe, for instance, where I'll start with my slide, there's 4 countries or 4 areas where we could particularly say something has happened which is specific to social enterprise. It's not the case everywhere. I won't go in depth into these, and another thing that I wanted to emphasise today was our interest and keenness to follow up with those on the webinar afterwards. Irene's already given some information about the wider programme, and we'll say more later about how that might happen. I want to provide an overview, give a flavour, maybe draw out some lessons and some sort of trends that we're seeing, but in terms of specific examples, I don't want to pretend to be an expert in what's happened in Cape Verde or what's happened in Portugal, but just to give a flavour and an overview. So here are 4 countries: France, Portugal, Scotland, and the United Kingdom more widely, where governments have taken action to recognise the crisis, recognise its impact on social enterprises, and to take steps to do something about that through policy. I think there's, I guess, 6 types of measures that we've seen within this, and you can recognise them on this slide and as we go through on the other slides. The first one is a very simple one, which is really around, if you want to call it, liaison. So you can see in France, and Sarah can tell us more about this, a liaison unit which was set up. We can see this also, I think, in Kenya, where the government said, in order to facilitate communication at this sort of time of crisis, we need to set up structures and communication channels that help us understand the impacts on the ground. Many countries have things like that anyway. They have standing structures of sort of social economy advisory boards or social enterprise panels, but that's one step that we've seen countries do more of, is set up particular units and networks to allow that communication in itself. Maybe not action, but it helps with the development of more sensible and evidence-based and appropriate policy. The second thing I think is a very simple one, perhaps around deferral of payments of various kinds. So with the sort of immediate financial impact of the crisis, organisations closing, perhaps shops, restaurants, other parts of the economy simply not being open, the lack of clients and customers and reducing the income and the earning potential of businesses, we've seen steps taken to allow payments to be delayed. Now that may be payments of tax, for instance, you can see in Portugal. It may be related to credit facilities, but actually it seems to be quite a common thing we've seen in many countries, is allowing a later payments of monies owed, particularly to the states and to the tax authorities. The third thing we've seen is new finance actually be injected into this part of the economy. So we've seen that in a couple of countries. Specific plans set up. Scotland is a really good one, aimed directly at a certain part of the social economy, and so here are new funds, here are new finance models made available. We know that maybe organisations need extra credit, they need to support their cash flow, working capital. Underneath, they may be viable, just commercially viable entities, sustainable in the long run, but at this stage they need additional finance to help them through the crisis. So that's the kind of the third step I think that we've seen. The fourth one is around the terms of finance which has already been provided. So we might see things like payment holidays, interest-free periods, deferral of repayments of loans, for example. So again, you can see some of that in Portugal. We've had some of that in the UK and elsewhere. So where finance already existed, the investors and the finance providers, perhaps specialist social or impact investors, allowing for a longer repayment profile. The fourth one is, I think, what I would call funding, and I think this is one of our important lessons that we've learned in our work, is a distinction between finance and funding. You might think about investment and income, capital, revenue, etc. For many organisations, money is their most important sort of desire, and in lots of our research work, it's often the most common barrier facing social enterprises is access to money. But it's not always clear whether they mean finance, repayable type finance, investment type finance, or indeed funding, which might be more around revenue or grants or support. And I think it's important to remember that distinction, that access to finance may mean finance in the sense of loans or debt or even equity. Sometimes it just means grants, donations, income, revenue, etc. And I think there have also been some new funds in a number of countries, France, Scotland and elsewhere, which actually are, if you like, free capital. We're not talking about repayable finance, it's additional injections of revenue to certain businesses. The final sort of type of intervention you've seen, I think, is ones which are maybe not directed explicitly at the social enterprises or the social economy. They're aimed at people, disadvantaged people, people who are vulnerable to the crisis in particular, but using social enterprise and the social economy as a sort of means of delivery of support to those people. So using that mechanism as a way to reach people who might suffer, particularly in a time of crisis. So those are the kind of sort of 4, 5, 6 types of intervention. You can see some here on the screen in Europe. And then if we also look in other parts of the world, we can see again the same 5 or 6 trends. So I've identified a few examples here in Kenya, Sudan, in South Africa, and then in a number of different countries. And now we're getting more into particularly Africa, but also a sort of wider mix of countries. And again, you can see similar pattern of interventions, some around finance, some around new funds. So there seem to be a number of funds in many African countries which have been referred to as solidarity funds, which are not exclusively for the social economy, but they seem to be playing a big role in it. Huge ambition to raise money from corporations, from philanthropists, from private foundations, to maybe match that with government support, or in South Africa, for instance, to make some donations that have additional tax exemptions, raising significant amounts of money to then be channeled again to individuals in need, but using voluntary sector, social enterprises, businesses grounded in community to deliver the resources to people in need. New funds, so a youth entrepreneurship fund in Chad, for instance, again, not necessarily explicitly social enterprise, but very much around entrepreneurship for the benefit of communities. In Nigeria, you can see the example about a moratorium on loans, so making the repayment profiles more considerate or flexible, for instance. So again, in different countries, very different contexts, but these same kind of 6 measures. Perhaps in these countries that we're looking at here, in Kenya, Sudan in particular, South Africa, quite a lot of support aimed at the cooperative sector, which makes sense. There's ministries and departments for cooperatives in many of these countries, but not always explicitly. So again, not too precious around the forms as such, but you can see those 5 or 6 types of government intervention. The last stage really that I wanted to focus on was to go back out again to say, yes, it's great from our perspective as advocates and supporters of social enterprise to see governments respond to those kinds of organisations and take steps to recognise their particular circumstances and their particular needs. But we must never forget, and it's probably also the first thing we should think about if we're honest, what are governments doing for business more widely, and how does social enterprise impact businesses, inclusive businesses sit within that? I think first question, are they able to access it? And we found in many instances in the UK and elsewhere that often by accident, governments introduce policies for business, and they sometimes unintentionally discriminate against certain forms of socially motivated business. This may be oversight, forgetting or not understanding the social economy. There's no intentional discrimination. Government thinks it's trying to help all sorts of businesses, but there's some kind of additional barrier or challenge which means that these policies don't really work for the social economy. So one of our focuses has always been on trying to ensure that measures for all business are equally open, accessible to social enterprises on a fair playing field, if you like, and that billions and even trillions of government support around the world for business can be directed to and accessed by the social economy. I won't go into detail on the French example. I'm sure Sarah can tell us more about that. But just for flavour, again, two very different contexts in the Russian Federation and in Cape Verde. We've seen some policies. There's more detail on some of these on the IMF website, which is quite useful as well. And I think we had a colleague from Cape Verde. I'd love to find out a bit more information about this one. But again, moratorium on payments, easing the repayment of investment in Cape Verde for households, companies, non-profits and SMEs, which would include social enterprises. And if that step's been taken for the economy as a whole, then that's very important for social enterprises. And there may be less need for a social enterprise specific response in that case. Similar in Russia, there was one of these tax holidays for taxes for SMEs, NGOs providing social services. So a general, much wider measure that's taken, but could be very important for certain businesses. One final comment on that, really, I think, just to give some examples of that accidental discrimination, I think we've seen in the UK, for instance, the government introduced support for business, additional support for business, but in one of the sort of the small print, the detail of the policy, there were some rules around whether those businesses had to be trading businesses to qualify for the support. Now, actually, that was fine for us, for our social enterprise members who are trading and their social enterprises who define themselves as trading. But for many charities, for instance, philanthropic organisations, they found they weren't eligible for that support. Now, the government didn't mean to exclude charities, but they just hadn't really thought through the implications. Another example of that would be where governments in many countries have introduced steps to support the flow of equity investment, perhaps buying stakes in companies, perhaps easing the situation for venture capital style investors, equity investors, without really thinking through that many of our cohort of organisations in the social economy don't or can't issue equity. They're structured in different ways. They perhaps have cooperative types of capital, or they're entirely non-profit and they don't issue shares and don't issue dividends. So yes, there may be a scheme around equity investment, but for these organisations, it just didn't work and they weren't eligible. It's a case of a sort of not understanding the nuances of the social economy and social enterprises. And a lot of our work has been fighting, battling to reverse that accidental discrimination to include measures which allow us to get back in to access those mainstream funds. Finally, even in the UK, we had one form in the Department for Business that asked for you to fill in your company number when you asked for assistance. And some of our cooperatives in the UK, they registered as societies rather than companies, and they simply couldn't fill out the form. They weren't even not eligible. There was just nowhere for them to put their number in on the form. So these kind of making sure that mainstream finance departments, departments for business, departments for enterprise are cognizant and aware of how they might be creating accidental hurdles and fighting to overcome those. And we've seen, I think, in some countries like France and Portugal, the social economy being in the forefront of some of these measures. In other countries, too much of that accidental discrimination. I will pause there for now. You've probably heard quite enough of me, but I'd like to just pass on to Sarah. Owen's explained to us Sarah's role. I think we're very lucky to have Sarah. I'm really pleased to hear from her that she's found the time to talk to us and to tell us a bit about some of the steps that have been taking place in France and give us more of a concrete insight into one particular policy or step that's been taken. So thank you very much. It's been great to be part of this so far, and I'm really keen to learn more from others. And please, Sarah, I'm delighted that you can join us.
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me. I think so. Yes. Okay. So yeah, thank you again. I think sharing experiences is very important, and to be inspired by those best practices, just like Dan, you've just done, that was really inspiring even for us. We don't know we can't know everything. So of course, the COVID-19 crisis strongly affected the French enterprises in the social and solidarity economy sector. It affected them in two ways. The first, for those whose activity was strongly or even completely stopped, and the second for those whose activity were directly at the front or the second line of the crisis. Regarding the first one, we do not yet have official statistics. Studies are underway by the type of organization of social economy. So for information, like you said, we have a legal framework, and so the French law considers 5 SSE families: association, mutuals, cooperatives, foundation, and social entrepreneurs, but that's not our topic today. A first study, however, was carried out by the Mouvement Associatif. It's the big network for association. And it revealed that more than 2/3 of the association operated at less than 20% of their normal activity during the period of lockdown. And the most affected by this shutdown, they were the small cultural and sport association. 9 out of 10 associations at the shutdown are education sector. And nearly 1/3 of the associations say that they lack visibility in the short and medium term in financial terms. So like you said, finance is very, very important for SSE. Regarding the second ones, we could see how essential the social economy was during the crisis, whether in health, social, medical, or food, for example, agriculture. These SSE enterprises have greatly contributed to the national effort. So in response to the crisis, the French government has implemented immediate support for all enterprise, and we just saw that in Dan's slide. So it was deferred payment deadlines. In the most difficult situation, we had direct tax rebate, the deferral of rent and bills payment, the aid of 1,500 euros for small businesses, the mobilization of the state to 300 billion euros to guarantee the bank cash lines, the support from the state and the Banque de France, so credit mediation, the maintenance of employment in enterprises through the simplified and reinforced partial unemployment, which is very important, the business ombudsman to support as well, and then we had specific plans like one for exporting enterprises. So with the crisis, we saw that many SSE organizations had to cease completely their activity or postpone projects, and some of which were subsidized. So in a circular that we fight for as the High Commissioner, the Prime Minister said that the state should support them and maintain the grants and urge other public authorities to do the same, so at regional, department, and cities level. And now regarding social economy enterprises specifically, so the High Commissioner quickly set up, like you said, Dan, the liaison unit. So to go in details, this liaison has met virtually every week, so it was every Friday since the start of the crisis, and we are still doing it. It also brought partners with representatives from Caisse des Dépôts and France Active, BPI France, so it's all more finance partners. So each week we was allowed to hear the networks, to know the points of attentions, the feedbacks, the difficulties that enterprises had, for example, with access to the aids because of sometimes definitions of what social economy is. And in addition, we got various ministers and state secretaries that intervened. So for example, we had the Minister of Health, so he could directly speak to the social economy actors. So it was really make it possible to discuss certain sectors or certain measures in particular, deeply, and to have direct exchanges between actors in the social economy and the government. We also invited representatives of association and local elected representatives like regions and cities, because in France, social economy is also, part of the different budgets of regions and cities, for example. Something that wasn't not mentioned earlier is that we worked on a document specifically for social economy actors that was listing all the measures taken by the government that could be of interest to other enterprises in the social and solidarity economy. So this document was sent almost every day and published on social media to make sure that it was accessible to many people as possible. So it's now almost 40 pages. And this document is classified into several parts: references with the useful, official website links and text, new measures and announcements compared to the previous document, so that all the social enterprise people didn't have to look for the new measures. And then measures to support businesses, measures by sector, regional, like I said, authorities support plans, support for the health professional, as it's a big part of social economy sector in France, health recalls, and the post-lockdown plan. So in addition, the High Commissioner has implemented a specific measure, like Dan already talked about. It was really to fill a missing point in the former support measure that I told you about. So the whole purpose of SSE Relief Facility was really to offer simple, rapid, and flexible emergency aids to be as close as possible to the needs and diversity of situation of enterprises, associations of less than 3 employees, because the biggest one, they could have access to grants, loans, but not the smallest one. So it consists of a direct aid of the amount of 5,000 euros, and it's also accompanied by support. So you have, experts that are supporting you, especially in one program that we have that is called the Local Support Mechanism, the translation in English, and it will help the structure to carry out a self-diagnosis, a cash flow plan over 3 months, which will highlight the need for immediate funding and activate the measures, support devices deployed by the state, local authorities, and banking networks. So in parallel with all this action, the High Commission also launched a working group with several impact funds and financial organizations in order to discuss the mechanism that we put in place during the crisis, and also to make proposals already for the recovery. In order to supplement the government aids, we have also the French region that have adopted specific plans with the help of our Banque des Territoires, so it's our territories bank, which is public. Usually the regions and the bank have created a specific SSE fund of several million euros, and it was matched equally to support the structure of SSE. Some local authorities, some cities, for example, also put some plans on the table to support specifically local social economy enterprises. Now, regarding the recovery plan, the High Commissioner has our High Council for SSE, which brings together more than 17 personalities, actors, administration to work on a contribution. And at the same time, we are working on a plan with objective of having specific measures for SSE, because we know that SSE usually needs some specific measures. So we will focus on 2 points: what the crisis imposes us and what the crisis has revealed to us. And this therefore indicates both measures of reconstruction and then transformation of our system, society, economy. So these measures will have then to be arbitrated, of course, within the government. So we hope to have it to take place by the fall. We also will rely on several programs that we already made in place. So we have French Impact. It's our national accelerator for social innovation, and it's including territories and scaling up of SSE businesses. We have our kind of social business act. It's called the Growth Pact for SSE, which helps remove many obstacles to the development of social economy actors. We are also going to promote the development of impact investing through our first French outcomes fund that will be launched in a few days or weeks, depending on our new government, as well as the international level. We think that the lobbying must intensify, and in particular, thanks to our global alliance for social and inclusive economy that is called Pact for Impact, that are going to work again in a few weeks. The High Commissioner wishes also to strengthen cooperation between actors of the SSE, but also with more traditional enterprises, because we think that SSE must be a source of inspiration for our economy and our model for tomorrow. Finally, a few words on the international level, but I think that is most of interest for you. We have several projects going on, like the one in Kenya that is called ARESAC project. So it's Alliance for the Kenyan Network of Social Enterprise. That was carried out with our partners there, and after the High Commissioner visited Kenya last year. The objective is to support capacity building and coaching of members, mentorship from leading social entrepreneurs, and exposure to international social entrepreneurship events in France. And it's done with the CESOC, the Social Enterprise Society of Kenya, and we have other partners like E4 Impact Foundation and Ashoka. And finally, to make a global view, we have the French Development Bank, AFD Group, that is stepping up its support for social and inclusive business in developing country strategies. So before 2023, the AFD Group will be allocating 1 billion euros to support more than 500 businesses and impact lives of over 50 million people. The main objective of this program is to support social and inclusive projects, championing initiatives that support the very poorest, improving access to employment for the most vulnerable, getting social and inclusive business projects off the ground, helping social and inclusive business stakeholders to grow, and of course, strengthening the institutional framework, which is quite needed, especially with the crisis. Another final example, the AFD Group also supported a study on social entrepreneurship in 16 African countries. And the report that was just launched last week gives 16 mapping to give a precise and in-depth vision of ecosystems. So company profile and practices, detailed analysis of institutional, political, and legal context, study of funders and investors, and support training structure, analysis of program, projects, and actions, public and private development. It was really made with people on the ground directly in the 16 countries. We have a maturity assessment which compares and reveals the potential. So assessment of the maturity of each country's ecosystem on the basis of 40 indicators and selection of 10 promising countries. And thanks to these promising countries, then they have done 10 proposals of action plan to develop in consultation with local stakeholders in order to structure advocacy and an ecosystem favorable to the development of social and inclusive business over the next 3 years. So that's the whole vision of what we're doing at the moment, and I will be really happy to answer any question that you can have. And thank you very much again for inviting me today.
Thank you, Sarah. That's really great to hear from you, and thank you so much for joining us. Really interesting stuff there, and I think between you and Dan, you've really highlighted the importance, I guess, whether it's directly or indirectly, that governments and ministries and departments are recognizing the specific needs of whether we call them social enterprises or the social economy or impact businesses, and that actually maybe there are specific needs there which need to at least be recognized and considered. And the accidental discrimination is, I imagine, more often than not the kind of key barrier. It's not through any intention, but it's just through not necessarily understanding fully the specific challenges and demands of social enterprises for them to do what they do best. Now we've got to a point, a kind of interim period in this session where we're going to have a kind of 10-minute period where people are free to, obviously, because we're all in webinars, you're obviously free to have a break, to go grab a drink, but it's also an opportunity to ask questions specifically of Dan and Sarah, I would say. We have had a couple of questions through. I would just reiterate, and I don't know if I said this earlier, but given the structure of the Investment Climate Facility and the kind of aims and objectives of this session, the priority is very much on hearing from people who have questions relating to African, Caribbean and Pacific countries, and for people from those regions. Of course, if there are other questions coming through, we will try and find time to address those as well. But in the initial period, this is kind of focused on people from those countries. So if you're from those regions, please do feel free to put anything either in the chat, which I understand is a little bit more obvious and accessible, or there's a question tab as well. There should be in your panel, and I will be looking at some of these questions and directing them to who I think is best positioned to answer them. So Sarah, I mean, I'm not giving you any kind of forewarning here, but we have a question from John Murphy. Sarah has mentioned the ALESA program by the French government in Kenya. Could more information be shared about that particular activity? I don't know whether you want to talk more about that in brief, or whether there is a kind of link that you're able to put in the chat.
I will look at the link. To be honest, it's really organized, and we're supporting it, but our French embassy in Kenya is very organizing everything. We're going to have an event to launch the whole initiative in September, but I'll already give you a link and maybe the contact of our French embassy and Peter Olo, who is the main organizer of social entrepreneurs in Kenya. So I'll give you some more information in the chat. What is really important is really that they're going to support the development of social entrepreneurship in Kenya. Really, the idea is to have really, train them on the entire ecosystem in Kenya. Also to try to have some funding to support them to talk to investors. Also to make some networks in France, but also abroad. So that's one program. It's really starting at the moment. It will be officially launched in September. So I'll be glad to give you some more information, and please feel free to contact them. I'm sure they will be very happy to have a bigger network after this webinar.
That's great, thank you. And I'm sure if it doesn't go in the chat, it is something that can be sent around in a follow-up email. I hope the organisers have the email address of everybody that registered. So that's great, thank you. Another question we had is more specifically focused on the UK, but I do think it carries some relevance to ACP countries, and maybe Dan, you'll be able to kind of point it in that direction and take some broader lessons from this question. It's a kind of three-pronged question, so maybe you can decide which you're up for answering. They're from Marjorie Bahaj in London. Number one is, where do we stand in the UK with Brexit? And I think the broader question here is about us needing to be working as a collective in problem solving, and that Brexit is an example of us not necessarily being able to work collectively and there being division, but that applies as much in lots of countries across the three regions we're especially interested in here. So interested in your thoughts on that. The second one, which also probably has broader learning in terms of responses, is basically what are dormant accounts in UK? So maybe we can talk a little bit more about that and how the government have been able to use them and put them to use. And finally, fund allocations must have transparency and accountability to prevent corruption. So will all projects submit spreadsheet reports and clearly demonstrate how all in need of help received help? I guess this is just a broader question about the tracing the impact and the channel and the route of funds and investment to ensure that those most in need, whether it's through social enterprises or otherwise, are supported. So take your pick or answer all of them.
Thank you, Owen. Yeah, I'll do my best. I think on the fund allocations and the sort of point about corruption and other funds going where they're intended to be, I think there's been some really interesting changes in the last 6 months, really, from grant-making trusts and foundations, which are most interesting. I know for many social enterprises, impact businesses, it's not really about grants, it's about trading. But there's some really interesting developments from the foundation community, where on one hand, yes, absolutely it's crucial to ensure that the legality of funds, the governance of the organisations that are being the recipients of funds is critical. But once that kind of due diligence has been established around, is the organisation who it says it is, does it have appropriate governance, checks and balances, processes, legal status and so on. Once that's established, there's been quite almost a shift, I think, in terms of trying to sort of give freedom to organisations to use resources as they see fit to support people. And it's maybe actually in the opposite spirit of how the question was asked. For many years, people have talked around the difference between restricted and unrestricted funding, and actually the transaction costs and the waste and the inefficiency of organisations in the social economy having to report back to funders to evidence and prove that they can direct the resources exactly in line with the stipulated terms and conditions. You know, I mean, I can touch on Brexit briefly. I'm not a big fan of Brexit, but one issue with EU funding, for example, in the UK is the huge amount of time and transaction costs of when you are a recipient of EU funding, of the reporting requirements that actually kind of detract from the usefulness of that funding and how you could be using to help communities. So I think we've seen organisations like the Ford Foundation in the US, like Esme Fairbairn in the UK, others around the world, who in this time of crisis where quick action is needed, they've said, look, if the organisation can show that it is a bona fide, trusted organisation with the right governance, crucially the governance is right, the mission is locked in, the assets are locked, actually we're not going to be very tight with our terms and conditions. We will say, we can see that you're the organisation that is committed to your community. Here are the funds, and a rise in flexible, agile, unrestricted funding. That's perhaps not what was intended, and I don't want to talk about Brexit too much, but that's one thing I can say is, you know, there's been so many EU funds which have been so sort of brilliantly designed in conception, but the transaction cost of the implementation is quite difficult. So I'm really pleased to see that funders taking that flexibility in recent months. On dormant accounts, which I just mentioned quickly, again, like Sarah, happy to share further detail. The UK instigated this about 10, 12 years ago. I was involved in some of the sort of government and the law that introduced it. It's been replicated, I think, in Japan, in Canada. And this is a very sort of specific idea, which, starting with bank accounts, there are a number of bank accounts held by banking institutions in names of people who they cannot trace. So maybe it was someone that had a bank account in 1947 and they died or forgot about it, or they moved overseas, and the bank is unable to find that customer, but it's that customer's money. So the bank can't just take it, it has to hold it there. And the government in the UK introduced legislation that said if a certain time has passed, now that might be 10 years, it might be 25 years, you cannot sort of identify that person, you can't reconcile them with their money, some of that money could be released for good causes. There needs to be a kind of insurance scheme that if they did come forward, you can recompensate them, but to hold some of that money back just in case, but to release the rest for good causes. So we had in the UK the Dormant Accounts Act, which has now released hundreds of millions of pounds in various ways, but one of the ways it's been specifically directed towards social enterprises through something called Big Society Capital and other institutions. Canada has something very similar, Japan has something very similar. They're now looking at expanding it to not just bank accounts, but old insurance policies that have been forgotten about. People also talk about things like Amazon gift vouchers or the kind of cards that you load up to travel on public transport. If there's unclaimed monies which are being held and are sort of lost in the system, governments can take steps to release that money for good causes. So we've kind of pleased that we've managed to take steps on that in the UK. Haven't got it all right. Other countries doing it too, and I think there's potential for more countries to do more of that in future. It takes a long time to release it though, so it's not the kind of thing you can necessarily do in response to the COVID crisis.
That's great, thank you, Dan. The questions have started coming in a little bit. I don't know if we'll get through them all now, but I also don't want to kind of interrupt the momentum, which people obviously are feeling. So Sarah, there's a question here. I was from Marcus Dietrich. I was at the launch of Pact to Impact. Can you expand on its current status and potential role in post-COVID-19 recovery? And then if you're able to be brief, just because we have two other questions which are specifically focused on Tanzania and Sudan, which I would like to get to as well.
Yes, so we launched like now 1 year ago Pact for Impact. We were actually supposed to have continental regional events. So it was supposed to be Ivory Coast, Canada, and a European one. Of course, it's completely stopped with the COVID. So we really are starting to make sure that in the fall we go back to those activities. We're going to have a HLPF, you know, the side events of the high-level political forum next week. We'll send invitation probably tomorrow that will talk about social economy because it's important, and to make sure that the alliance continues its work. We just launched a public procurement to have a permanent secretariat, so I'll get in touch with you, Marcus, directly, but we'll also have, you know, the website and everything will be relaunched in the fall. So continue to follow us, and we'll, you know, build it together, and it was completely stopped because of the COVID, definitely.
Perfect, thank you, Sarah. And there's a couple of questions here which I'm going to kind of put together, I guess, because they're both very much focused on collaboration. And I think I'll provide a response initially but maybe Sarah will have a response as well. It's up to you. I'm not entirely sure whether it's more focused at the British Council or the ICR Facility or Sarah's government. But firstly, from Tanzania, the question from Alexa Hayden. In EU delegation Tanzania, they are starting the Begin programme to support the business environment for social businesses and startups. Are you working with the delegation to amplify and support these two programmes? And secondly, thank you British Council in Sudan for extending an invitation to attend this webinar. This is from Basma Saeed from UNDP ACLAB in Sudan. The question is there any thinking around collaboration with UN agencies such as UNDP to amplify work and leverage comparative strength for this socio-economic support? So I think I would broadly say from a British Council perspective, and I know others will be doing their own things with the organisations, certainly the British Council, Tanzania is an interesting example actually, because currently the British Council has a social enterprise profile and activity in I think it's 7 countries in sub-Saharan Africa and more in the north of Africa. And Tanzania is an emerging one which we're beginning to work with to speak about social enterprise. So hopefully our representative from the Tanzania office is involved today, and I know she's been very proactive about thinking about social enterprise and what we can do, and I know they're looking at ways of submitting requests through this investment climate facility. And I think in all of these cases, certainly the British Council would be looking at who is already doing stuff in this area in the country, what's already going on, how and whether we can add value, and who we might partner with that has an interest in social enterprise or broader concepts relating to the impact economy as a whole. And certainly I think the way forward is certainly collaboration in this field, and there's a lot of duplication, and there always has been, and standing on other people's feet, and I think it's important for all of us to obviously try and avoid that. And secondly, a similar question from the Basma Saeed in Sudan. The British Council already has a presence and activity in social enterprise in Sudan. We are looking at a social enterprise report, which Dan worked on actually, and trying to get that published. But obviously, I think in sub-Saharan Africa, there's also the challenge that comes with states which can be unstable in areas and go through particular periods of fragility, which does interrupt to some extent this work, especially when we're trying to get a sense of what already exists within a country around social enterprise, and therefore how governments can most effectively support them. I know Dan previously delivered I think a policy masterclass in Sudan, so I'm sure he was, hopefully there were some UNDP representatives there. And I would also say at a broader level in Africa, we are working with an offshoot of the UNDP, which is called Impact Africa, which is very much focused on impact investment and supporting that kind of wider infrastructure. And I know Dan and others have touched on that, and actually it's going to be the focus of our next webinar in a couple of weeks' time, which I'll give links to at the end there. Okay, I don't know whether Sarah or Dan, you had anything quick to add in response to either of those points.
I just also wanted to mention in another part of the world, we have very, very good relationships through the British Council with UNESCAP. So anyone in the Pacific region, it's been, they're incredibly supportive for the British Council's work and social enterprise work in a number of countries in Southeast Asia. So it might be interesting to look at UNESCAP's role there as well.
Great, thank you, Dan.
Yeah, I'll just add that, like I said, we are really beginning our big strategies in developing countries through our development agency. So I don't know exactly about Tanzania, but I'll get the information about UNDPs and all UN agencies. I'll advise you to look at the UN Task Force for Social and Solidarity Economy. This is a task force that has the main UN agencies, and now they have a new working program. We are working very closely with them. They're trying, to get at another level, and so definitely I will advise you to get in touch with them and try to push for your subject if you have some, to make sure that then you have more UNDPs involved in your topics on the ground. But I think it's something. So UN Task Force for Social and Solidarity Economy.
Perfect, thank you, Sarah. And just before I introduce the next session, it would be useful to hear from Irene on this topic, who will be speaking from the perspective of the Investment Climate Reform Facility. So Irene, please.
Yeah, thank you, Owen. I just wanted to add that, the questions that have come from Tanzania and Sudan, this is why the ICR facility has been set up. We have been set up to support initiatives ongoing, already been taken in these countries to support the business environment reform. So we are working with the EU delegations in ACP countries, the 79 ACP countries, which include Tanzania. So the EU delegation in Tanzania, if you are doing anything related to the business environment reform, we would like to speak with you, and we would like to see how best we can provide technical assistance to support you, as well as in Sudan. We are working with government ministries, government agencies, departments, business associations. Once again, if you check your user panel, you will see a fact sheet on the investment climate. So any work you're doing in the business environment reform, do let us know, and we'll see if we'll be able to provide you the technical assistance needed to implement that. So I wanted to also add that. Thank you.
Thank you, Irene. That's great. Now, I do have a question from John Meeks, and we will get to that, but I think it's probably best if for the moment we just move on to the next session, and there will be more opportunity for questions and answers later. So I'll return to that question then. I will also just flag that on your screens at the moment, there is some information about the virtual one-on-one clinics that will be taking place in the next couple of weeks. These are open for people and organizations from the ACP, Africa, Caribbean and Pacific regions to submit a request to have, where they can hear from some of the people that you've heard speaking, that you will hear speaking today, and to address specific questions and get support and advice on certain areas of interest, especially around business environment reform and investment climate reform in those regions. And I would also flag that we are especially looking for those requests to come from organizations that have some sort of mandate or potential or remit to influence the business environment. So rather than individuals that might have an interest, it would be great to hear from organizations that would like to hear more. And there's some of the details on the screen there. We'll put them up again at the end of the session, but there is an email address at the bottom, so you can register your interest until 16th of July, and we'd love to hear what your particular interests and questions are. So please do get in touch. So just to introduce this next session, we are going to be hearing from two people, and we're going to be specifically moving on from policy, I guess, to talk more widely about the sector-wide responses to the COVID-19 situation by social enterprises and impact businesses and so forth from around the world. Firstly, we will be hearing from Maeve Curtin. Maeve is Social Enterprise World Forum's Strategic Policy Advisor, where she leads on policy consultation, global research, and youth engagement initiatives. She is also working towards a PhD in social policy, studying the development and transfer of social enterprise policies internationally. Before starting her PhD and joining the Social Enterprise World Forum, Maeve worked with a variety of NGOs, social enterprises, non-profits and government organisations around the world to improve reporting and research practices and enhance community engagement. So we're first hearing from Maeve, and we'll then be hearing from Kissy Agyeman-Togobo. And Kissy is co-founded Songhai Advisory in Ghana in 2010 after years of experience working with leading international risk and global information consultancies focused on sub-Saharan Africa. Songhai Advisory provides local knowledge, strategic analysis and risk assessment, facilitating transformative and sustainable investment in sub-Saharan Africa. Their portfolio of clients operating in the region includes SMEs, FTSE 100 firms, international organisations and government. Kissy brings an analytic approach to the Songhai Advisory team and holds an LLB English and French law, risk management in developing countries postgraduate from Sciences Politique, Bordeaux, and a diploma in governance, risk and compliance from the International Compliance Association. So it's really great that we're going to be hearing from both Maeve and Kissy. I will, for the moment, pass over to Maeve Curtin. So please, Maeve.
Hi, everybody, and thank you so much, Owen. As Owen mentioned, I will be speaking sort of on the wider environment in which we're seeing the social enterprise ecosystem respond to COVID-19. And to begin, I think one thing that we've touched on a little bit throughout this presentation so far is the fact that impact investors and social finance organizations are intervening in the absence of significant government investment. So we know that low-income countries are being hit hardest by COVID, and so some global investment firms like Finca have developed emergency response funds to provide emergency relief to low-income countries and specifically bridge support for early-stage social enterprises. I know we have people from Ghana, Uganda, Malawi, Botswana, Mozambique, Kenya, Nigeria, Madagascar, and Zambia all on this call from the ACP. Those are all countries where social enterprises are eligible for this type of support because it's in the footprint. And also I know we have people from Jordan, Myanmar, outside of ACP registered you would also be eligible for support. And so this is an example of a fund that is specifically giving support to social enterprises. We also are seeing examples where there may be regional support for impact businesses. That is like the example on the top right of the slide that you see, where the Vital Impact Relief Facility has been developed to counteract the expected decline in foreign direct investment by about 30 to 40% and provide significant amounts of capital to businesses that are going to have impacts by providing essential services on large groups of people. Right now, they've started providing that fund in Kenya and Uganda. But we'll slowly be expanding to the DRC, Angola, Senegal, Ghana, and the Ivory Coast. One thing that I will mention while I'm briefly explaining some of these fund options is that the next webinar that the ICR is hosting is going to be on funding options in response to COVID. And that's something that you guys will receive information on in the handout section of the panel. So just be on the lookout for that. There'll be a lot more to come on this type of material. The other two sort of responses in the finance realm that I'll mention are those coming from larger corporate organizations like Visa that are not necessarily directed at social enterprises or impact businesses, but that social enterprises and impact businesses are eligible for. And the Visa specifically includes $200 million to support small and micro businesses, particularly those with a focus on women's empowerment. But the interesting thing about Visa that's important here to note is that that's a long-term strategy. So a lot of these funds are sort of immediate response to COVID. And we see some of these funds starting to dry up already because the demand is so intense. And so where we really need governments and intermediaries to step up and partner and figure out how to support the critical social enterprise sector going forward, is something that we're hearing from Big Society Capital and other funders specifically focused on social enterprise funding in the UK. They have developed a resource portal for social enterprises. So something that I would put to all of you is, you know, within your organizational capacity, how can you develop and signpost resources? I'm sure many of you are already doing this, but how can your government organization or intermediary or what it may be help support? And we'll give more examples of that pretty soon. But basically, the funders are concerned because the demand is not something that they can meet right now. And so they've actually called on government leaders to make more funds available. And I think that that is a call to the sector that we need to be figuring out across the board in all countries how we can support these essential services provided by the sector. Now, thinking beyond funding and that call to intermediaries and to governments is that there has been a response from intermediary organizations. If you see on the next slide here, that has really been about advocacy and joining together to lobby the government for more support, to encourage governments to provide more funding. And what we have seen is that in some cases, intermediary organizations have actually formed, in the case of Australia. In others, in the case of Ethiopia, social enterprises that are part of these larger networks have formed together in really impressive partnerships to deliver services that, you know, the government is supportive of, but perhaps wasn't providing otherwise. And then in the case of South Korea, that it's a really useful example of government lobbying and support. And I know it's not an ACP region, but I do want to mention it because I think it's particularly important in the context of social economy in Africa. We know from some of our colleagues in the ILO that many cases, informal economy actors and operators across African countries and social and solidarity economy enterprises have been left out of program support entirely. And where they haven't been left out or able to access it, they've been excluded from targets related to monitoring and evaluation. And so why this is important is because in South Korea, what we saw is that sector lobbying actually, in the face of this pandemic, led to the creation of a social economy advisor office set up beneath the president. And so what actors in that country are hoping will happen is that they'll be able to bridge the demands between the sector and what the government is actually able to deliver by placing social economy on the agenda. And we've seen that in examples. I think we heard that from Sarah, that when there is ministerial support and when there are these collaborative bodies that are meeting to discuss and come up with solutions in a co-produced manner, that the outcomes tend to be better, and we tend to get more finance support, and we tend to just see even more localized action too, beyond the investment that governments can be given. So that task force is an example, and it led to positive outcomes, and I think it's something that we can look in other countries to be emulating. Now, finally, another impressive response has been from social enterprises on the ground. No, sorry, you were correct there, to switch the slide. And this is something that Kissy is going to talk about. But again, social enterprises individually and impact businesses have been stepping up, pivoting their services, and collaborating to enhance their impact. So even in the face of this crisis, social enterprises, which are critical parts of the social and solidarity economy and our economies generally around the world, have actually been the individuals who have continued serving and ensuring that our communities' needs are met. On this slide, you'll see pictures from individual social enterprises in Kenya, South Africa, and Malawi. And so we're going to go into examples more specifically on some of these larger sector-wide responses. And yeah, so on the next slide, you'll see, and Kissy will pop in here in a second after we've discussed some of these global sector-wide responses, and talk more about what's happening on the ground. I also just want to remind you, if you guys do have questions, send them through as I'm talking, and I'll be able to read them, and we'll be able to get them and hopefully try to interact with you a little bit more. But one thing that I'll note is in Australia, that a social enterprise network was actually formed in response to COVID, and that has placed this on the national agenda. So I think what can be learned from this example is how can we partner effectively to ensure that we're better advocating at the national scale? Are there partners who are working sort of in isolated local contexts in the country you can work with? And this harkens back to the question that we finished that last Q&A period with, is where can we be forming strategic partnerships? It's something we're seeing in Malaysia as well, with private-public partnerships that are providing investment opportunities for social enterprises, and allowing them to access essential finance to continue delivering collaborative community services that are addressing hunger and developing PPE. I mentioned earlier the example in Ethiopia, which is kind of a unique example of developing PPE, where 35 social enterprises, and you'll see more details about this example on the next slide, where 35 social enterprises came together and actually started to deliver a service for public health, and it's been endorsed by the ministers of health to achieve lots of important outcomes. And you did hear Sarah talk about what's happening in Kenya, but another example of the Social Enterprise Society of Kenya providing sort of this business support and being an intermediary between funding opportunities and strategic business partnerships. And so, again, the key to sort of all of these sector responses is this larger idea of partnership and what we can be doing to better advocate for the work that social enterprises are doing on the ground. We have a few more examples of what social enterprises are doing on the ground, but we've seen them working across a bunch of themes. There are tons of examples of them producing masks and other personal protective equipment. In Jamaica, we've seen this impact business, Edufocal, offer children engaging online education materials through gamification. And because of, again, a key partnership with a corporate organization, they've been able to make this platform free and accessible to so many students around the country who otherwise wouldn't have access to this. Increasing their impact by over 30,000 individuals who are receiving instruction and test prep and such that they are not getting in schools. And then finally, examples from Kenya and Sudan about addressing public health issues in the Kibera slum, and then also in Sudan using an education tech startup to deliver vital information about coronavirus and how it spreads, and really improve public health outcomes. And so what we're seeing, and I think why this matters, is that it's necessary for intermediary actors and governments to be doing everything that they can to support these on-the-ground social enterprises and impact businesses in this time of crisis, because it's these organizations that have been pivoting and responding and making sure that our communities are thriving. And you know, without them, the recovery phase looks very different. So now I'm going to hand it over to Kissy, who's going to give you more detailed examples of some of these social enterprise responses and how they are specifically adapting.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much, Maeve. Thank you. And good afternoon from Accra to everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you. And so thank you, Maeve, because what you've shared is a great segue into what I'm hoping to share with you over the next few minutes, which is the impact of COVID on the social enterprise landscape across sub-Saharan Africa. I'll start off by saying that, of course, right now, there are a number of unknowns. The data is still emerging. We are all getting to grips in terms of understanding what COVID means for all of us. But it is interesting at least to flag up some of the emerging patterns and themes that we are identifying in having spoken with social enterprises on the ground in Ghana and across other markets in sub-Saharan Africa. So on this slide, I've selected a few social enterprises from across the region. So we have a social enterprise from Namibia, Ghana, South Africa, Zimbabwe, Rwanda, and they are all engaged in different sectors. So from education to hospitality to livestock creative industries. And what's really interesting is that even though there's a plurality of sectors and countries that the social enterprises represent, there are points of convergence, which I think is interesting to note. So one that comes up quite strongly is that there's a real emphasis on digital technology, and I think most of us around this virtual table can attest to that. Social enterprises, like mainstream businesses, are really plugging into digital technology, perhaps more than ever before, from finding ways to connect with other social entrepreneurs, to trying to find new markets, trying to find consumers, in terms of sharing knowledge, sharing networks. Tech Village in Zimbabwe is an example of that. So it's a collaborative space for entrepreneurs where they go to share ideas and actually to pitch before going to, before sitting in front of investors. But that's what they were doing a lot of pre-COVID. But now the pitching, instead of it happening face-to-face, it's happening remotely and so forth. So that's something that explains or is an example of how digital tech is really front and center of what this organization is doing. Another social enterprise that we've engaged with is called Marimba Jam in South Africa. They say that they promote social harmony through music. Yeah, that's great. And it's women-led, and they really teach young people how to play marimbas. But as well as it being about music, it's also about helping young people to find a creative way of expressing themselves, sometimes through difficult circumstances. Pre-COVID, Marimba Jam would go into schools and engage with young people there, but since COVID, that's not been so possible. So they've been mobilizing and using digital technology to offer classes remotely via WhatsApp or via online tools like Zoom. But they do recognize that it's difficult because not everyone has that access to technology, but they feel that using the WhatsApp is perhaps more accessible than providing classes via Zoom, let's say, whereby you probably would need a laptop to do so. Another sort of point that seems to be, or theme that is emerging quite strongly, is that some social enterprises are introducing new sort of product lines into existing business operations. So an example of that is Bridge for Hope in Namibia. It's a school essentially, and they bring together, or they provide education to over 150 students in Rehoboth in Namibia. And how it's funded is that the majority of the students aren't able to pay school fees, or their parents aren't. So it's a small proportion that pays the school fees, which is able to keep the school afloat. So that is still ongoing. During the lockdown, they weren't able to have the physical classes, but they migrated online as well. But now that the school has reopened properly, classes have resumed. But in addition to holding the classes, they've also engaged in agriculture. So they are growing various types of crops and foodstuffs to sell within the community. So that's going to help in running sort of after school classes. And then there's also, they've also invested in a chicken coop. So that's really exciting. So that's a new area, and the idea is to sell the chickens within the community again. But they are really looking forward to, the macro environment also easing up, because in order for them to really expand and for that revenue stream to take hold, the border closure with South Africa needs to be lifted such that they can acquire the kinds of inputs they need in order to be able to generate the sort of the volume that they want to create through the chicken coops. Another example of a social enterprise that is introducing a new business line is Kawamoka in Ghana. And it's a cafe based in Accra, and it sources its coffee beans from female farmers in the Volta region of Ghana. And in aside to the cafe, so the cafe had been going pre-COVID, but they've also gone into processing of coffee beans, and the coffee beans can be purchased online now. So that's also a really exciting and new area. And having had a conversation with the founder recently, she was saying how having a processing side to the business is something that they'd always wanted to do, but this COVID has sort of just opened the way for this to happen at this point in time, and to really put in motion the sorts of ideas that had been in the background. There's also another social enterprise that is worth mentioning, which exemplifies this whole idea of adding a new sort of business line, and that's Letha Flora, and it's based in South Africa, and it's a boutique brand, and it's really about promoting wellness and promoting indigenous African products for health and well-being, and so they also promote artisanal jewelry and arts and crafts and so forth. But in addition to that, they've also pivoted into consulting, because being able to have the same sort of client base pre-COVID is not so straightforward. But consulting is an area that they feel they can add value and actually find more sort of clients that are curated, that have a real desire and a desire to procure and have a sort of consultation about wellness and about how to match wellness with what is being grown locally. So those are some examples. And I would say a third area whereby we've seen an emerging theme is in terms of companies actually needing to change their business models almost entirely. And I know Maeve sort of touched on that previously. There's one organization in Rwanda which had been focused on basket weaving and carpet weaving. But given the COVID situation, their client base, which had been very much focused on Kigali, has changed. And also the inputs that they need in order to be able to do the basket weaving and carpet weaving is not available. They're not available because of the border closures. So the founder had a sort of piggery business or an interest in the background, but given the state of affairs with his organization currently in COVID, he's actually pivoted so that the majority of what he's doing is around piggeries. So he's actually providing pigs to the rural areas, and especially targeting young women who would have been in schools but aren't. And so this is helping them to get another sort of revenue stream. So those are some of the emerging themes that we're seeing. Could I have the next slide, please? So just to conclude, really, it's to share that the current climate is presenting a lot of opportunities, but it also means that social enterprises like others are needing to dig deep and think quite creatively about what they already have in their stable and use that in order to be able to take hold of the current opportunities that present themselves. So I won't run through all of these, but some of the sort of solutions that stand out are agility, and I know that's been mentioned before. And this means thinking in ways that are innovative and not necessarily holding fast to, one way of doing. And I think that's critical in this time. And the conversations we've been having definitely attest to that. So the ability to explore new opportunities and make new collaborations is a huge part of being able to adapt to the current climate that we're in. Nurturing existing relationships is extremely critical as well. And I should say that not only is it important to nurture existing relationships, but to do that as a means of actually acquiring new relationships also. And that's key for knowledge sharing, for finding new clients, new business opportunities, to build brand awareness. It's all really, really critical to lean on the relationships one already has, and then also try to form new ones. Strong marketing campaigns is key. Having a very strong online presence, we've touched on that before, is really, really important. Word of mouth, webinars, like we're on roundtables. Of course, people, companies, clients aren't mobile or as mobile as they used to be. So the need for a really strong marketing push is key. But of course, that requires funding, that requires means to do that. But there are also sort of creative ways. So speaking with someone at Tech Village in Zimbabwe, they were saying how they're reaching out to community sort of residents associations in order to be able to really troubleshoot and see where the needs are, as opposed to relying on the ways that they formally found out about the need. They're really pressing into marketing and pressing into their relationships, and by virtue of that also marketing what they can do online and through organizations or associations that have really strong community level relationships. Preparedness is also a huge solution or a huge point that social enterprises need to really think about and work on, as with mainstream businesses. So, of course, that means in terms of putting money aside, and I know COVID is already upon us, so one may think, well, maybe I missed the boat on that one, but actually, the dynamics of the world and, life is such that there's always something to be prepared for. So it's really about not only putting aside funding or means, but it's also in terms of thinking about strategy, thinking about how best can we weather whatever changing dynamic is afoot. And that change can come from a regulatory change to something environmental. Here on the continent, of course, there's the Africa Continental Free Trade Area that should be happening fairly imminently. So always, it's really important to think about scenarios and to plan accordingly. And then the last point I will end on is with regards to being confident to follow the trend, to follow the need and not the trend. And by this, I mean that, well, social enterprises by definition are mission-led and are very much inspired by local context. And it's really key that social enterprises continue to really push into that mission and not be sort of swayed by what's going on, the hype maybe in the media and so forth, but rather stay true to the cause, which is the need and the local need, because that would drive everything. But I do appreciate it is a balancing act between staying true to that as well as ensuring that you have the right sort of commercials that can support that. So I'll press pause here, and I look forward to any questions that you may have for me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kissy and Maeve. Both of those talks were really, really great and insightful, and it's really great to kind of hear some of the variety from around the world, but also some of the common challenges that the COVID situation has obviously presented to organisations, which a lot of the time being driven by the social conscience and the social need are also fairly unstable, but can also be very agile, as I think you mentioned, and it's kind of been important in that for organisations to look at new opportunities, I guess, both where there's a need and through wanting to help, but also for their own organisation staying afloat. It's a kind of necessity, right? And it's going to be interesting, I think, as we kind of look forward to the next year and 2 years, how social enterprises are kind of adapting through the sort of to address the longer term situation that's kind of been thrown up by this, whether it's in terms of employment or greater need for certain services and support amongst communities and individuals. So that's great. Thank you so much to both of you. Really, really useful. Just to set out what's going to happen now, I know we're running out of time. We are still open to for questions and answers, whether they're to Kissy or to Maeve or to some of our earlier speakers as well. There is one which I'm going to return to that was asked earlier in a second. I just also, yeah, maybe we should go there directly now. So please do feel free to submit any questions, whether it's in the questions box or in the chat. Just to return to a question that was asked earlier, and I'm going to pass this to Irene in a second. We had a question from John Meeks, who says, Jamaica is in the initial stages of creating a framework for social enterprises, the standardization and registration of social enterprises, as opposed to NGOs and civil society organizations. How do NGOs access funding or support of benefit from the Investment Climate Reform Facility? And the second part of the question, I'm not sure I fully understand, but Irene maybe does. And would the non-social enterprise sector or economy negatively affect access to support from the Investment Climate Reform Facility? So Irene, maybe, yeah, if you're able to provide a response, that would be great.
All right, thanks, Owen. To start off, I would like to say that the Investment Climate Reform Facility is not only in place to support social enterprises. We are in place to support the business environment and investment climate that will support all businesses, including social enterprises, green enterprises, and any form of businesses. So I wanted to say that at first. The second thing I also want to say in response to the question is that we exist to provide technical assistance in business environment initiatives. So the question mentioned that you are in the process of setting up a framework or a legislature for social enterprises. So such business environment initiative, the investment climate will be happy to assist. We will provide technical assistance. The investment climate in itself do not provide funding. What we believe in that once we support you to create a conducive, inclusive, and sustainable business environment and investment climate, the country will be able to attract both local and foreign investment into your country. So as the facility, we do not provide funding, but we do provide technical assistance to help you create that conducive, sustainable, and inclusive environment that will be attractive to investors. So I hope that answers the question. In terms of who is eligible to apply to the facility, the fact sheet it gives more information, but I will mention that business associations, whether you're a social enterprise or not, we do support you. Government department, government agencies, the EU delegation. There's more in the fact sheet that is in the user panel, and we would like to hear from you. We provide technical assistance for you to create that conducive environment to attract more investment, more investors. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you, Irene. That's great. And I guess it's a useful reminder that the Investment Climate Reform Facility isn't only focused on social enterprises. That's an area that British Council particularly brings to the facility, but other delivery partners bring expertise in other areas. So it is worth exploring and looking at that fact sheet. I would also say from the British Council perspective, and specifically on social enterprise, that much of the work that we have done and supported in sub-Saharan Africa and in other regions of the world has kind of enabled the wider sector of NGOs and socially focused organizations, has given them more freedom to trade, because obviously often this is a kind of key barrier, right, for NGOs. It's that inability to trade because of how they're constituted. Actually, our focus on social enterprise a lot of the time in supporting enabling policy has had broader positive ramifications for organizations and giving them freedoms to diversify their model and to look into income generation as a method of sustaining their work. Let me just see if any other questions have just come through. I think that is it for the moment. We'll probably draw this to a close in a minute. Worth pointing you to, hopefully you can see in your panel, there's 3 handouts which are currently there. So please do take a look at them and download them if they are of interest. They include the ICR Facility fact sheet. There will also be at the end of the session a feedback poll, which is just going to appear on your screen at some point, and which would be really useful to have your responses on, just to know if this was useful to you, that we haven't wasted your time, I guess. But I do also just want to finally, we mentioned it a few times during this session, I do also want to finally remind you about the one-on-one clinics that are available. So as I said earlier, but maybe some of you are on the break or getting a drink. So the one-on-one clinics are basically an opportunity to seek targeted and tailored support. A virtual one-on-one clinic that will bring you into contact with some of the speakers that we've heard from today. It's specifically for organizations that have a mandate to affect the business environment in a country that falls within Africa, Caribbean or Pacific regions. The slots will be granted based on availability and also to the extent that we think you're an organization that meets those criteria. The criteria are somewhat loose, but we also wouldn't want I guess we're looking for organizations to approach us. And the support will also respect regional balance across the African, Caribbean and Pacific regions. And you have until the 16th of July to register an interest in receiving some of that support and taking part in a one-on-one session. So please do email the address which is there, which is icrfacility@giz.de. And please, in that correspondence, indicate your organisation and the questions that you would like to pose. Now, I don't think, the presentation is also available for download in the audience user panel. I'm looking at various points on my screen, just trying to check that I've ticked everything off which is being presented to me. There haven't been any further questions, so I think we'll probably draw it to a close. There is future webinars taking place. A lot of the attention today is focused on finance or referenced finance for social enterprises, impact businesses, the social and solidarity economy. And that is going to be the focus of our next webinar on the 23rd of July at the same time. It's very much going to be looking into social finance and impact investing and what investors and financiers are doing within the COVID context to support social enterprises, how they're working with governments or not working with governments, and whether that kind of access to finance that's needed in many of these situations is available. So please do register for that, and I'm sure we will be sending around some further information and a link to register to that in the near future. So it would be great to see you all there. Nothing else to say really, apart from thank you very, very much for joining us. We hope to see you again. Thank you to all our brilliant speakers. Somebody has just got in a last-minute question, which I'm happy to address. Can you repeat the organisations that would qualify for one-on-one assistance? I think it's probably best if you are an organisation that has an interest in and a remit to bring about business environment reform within a particular country, or investment climate reform, and we can think about that quite loosely, in any of the kind of African, Caribbean and Pacific countries, then I think it's best if you just make initial contact and we can work from there. I imagine that many organisations will be eligible, and I don't imagine we're going to be too sort of strict. I think it was just that we were not looking for individual people that have an interest in this area, but don't necessarily have the mandate as an organisation to influence change. I think we're looking at organisations to get in touch. So please do that. They can be private or they can be public organisations. And I've also had another question. If you have more examples of social enterprise community or structural responses, please do email Maeve Curtin, and we can send her email address around as well in the follow-up information. But for information here, that's Maeve, M-A-E-V-E .Curtin, C-U-R-T-I-N @sewfonline.com. So if you have great examples that you think she should have spoken about, then please do get in touch with her and let her know. So without further ado, thank you very much again for attending. Thank you to our speakers, and we look forward to speaking to you and hearing from you soon.